Yeah, I'm Sam. I'm the founder and CEO of the Sentience Company, and our mission is to create hyper-accurate simulations of human beings. I was generally like a good student in that like I got good grades, but I like would skip class. I was like always late to class. I learned to code in detention, or like when I was even younger, like before detention was a thing, just like out in the hall because teachers would kick me out. So yeah, I think like that sort of set me on like, okay, I should probably not pursue like another 8 years of schooling and instead like try to find a way to channel this. And then frankly, I mean, beyond the sort of like negative impulse, there was just like, I had so much energy around building, and my favorite things to do was to make things both, from a coding perspective and as well as just like a physical perspective. The first like sort of like business, I guess, I started was selling Minecraft mods on the internet, which our chief of staff, Teddy, thinks I shouldn't say because it makes me seem immature, but whatever. I love to say that. I tell every single person that joins and that I interview. So that was how I kind of like really learned to like build and make things and sell them. Started a few businesses in college. I went to Columbia. Again, was like that. Columbia, I was a terrible student. Columbia, I knew I was not going to go to grad school, so everything was like basically bare minimum to graduate. And a handful of classes that I really loved, but interestingly, like those were kind of all over the place. I loved like the free speech class that was taught by the president of the university, Lee Bollinger. I think I got like an A or A plus in that class, but yeah, I graduated Columbia and yeah, was CTO and started a business called Macro, sort of straight out of school, or almost straight out of school. Scaled that through a couple rounds of funding and through some pretty amazing traction. And yeah, ultimately, like, I think realized, this was about a year ago now, or a little over a year ago, it's like something about the combination of like my own mortality plus like just like this idea of sort of my life's work, like what is that going to be? I always knew it was going to be this. Like it wasn't really like a question. I just like knew this was the thing, and it was more just like, okay, like how do we, A, just like acquire some initial capital, and then like B, like what is this hack? So yeah, that was about a year ago. Last summer, started the company, spent a bit of time kind of like prototyping and figuring out how this would work. And then we were lucky enough to kind of early on raise like an initial seed round of capital from Bain Capital and a handful of others. Yeah, now we're building what I think is like the future of humanity and sort of the hybrid between humans and AI. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The two drivers very clearly for you were the mortality piece and the life's work. Can you
Yeah.
talk more about how those two drivers came to sentience?
I don't know if this is the reason, but I suspect subconsciously it played a role, at least in like kind of the timing and stuff. Both my grandparents passed a couple of years ago. That was my like first encounter with death, which is, I'm very lucky to say that, right? Like they lived generally a long time, but there's something different between like reading about it or friends and family and so on versus like experiencing that. And yeah, I thought a lot about where is the essence of my grandparents. The answer is basically like they live in like the neural circuitry of my mind and then like the minds of like many others that knew them. So like literally there is like, you can't really measure it. There's not actually sophisticated enough scans, but like there are literally like my physical mind, like the molecules and like the actual matter of my brain does contain some marks of my grandparents, like their names, their memories, and so on, etc. Like this is not like a sort of hand wavy, spiritual thing. Like this is like they literally, there's some fingerprint in there, which I always found like fascinating. I also like think is kind of this like underexplored aspect. And then the sort of second piece, so that's like piece number one is like, okay, like where's the like time capsule of their essence? And then the second piece is like a little more practical, like a little more just kind of like literal with regards to like, a kind of use case, which is we can actually now, we now have like models of intelligence, but those models are sort of like, you take what OpenAI or Anthropic or Google or XAI gives you, and it's not quite like you don't actually have like a sort of like simulation of a human. You have sort of like a simulation of like an aggregate of like generally like the internet, which you can kind of steer. Like, of course you can prompt it and say, act like Elon Musk or like act like Donald Trump. But like, these are like very surface level simulations, or if you can even call it that. And then these like sort of only work for like people where it's like the corpus is already included in kind of like the public training set. So yeah, I mean, those two things, it's like, can we build a living representation of a human being that then can like operate and communicate for them? I think about like the remnants of like being able to do this for my grandparents. It's like, yeah, the things that live in my head, but most of it has been lost to the void, right? So yeah, like, can we actually, just like capture and preserve? That's sort of like step zero, is like, can we build a system that can capture and preserve from both latent data and then also data that's like lost to the void currently? So more practically, what I mean by that is like, something like a collection of emails or messages, whether it's text messages or whatnot. Those are sort of like already existing latent data sets that like aren't fully tapped. But then there's like a second category of things that just like aren't being captured at all. And then our thesis is like, if you can combine that, then you have like the highest fidelity representation of a person's essence. The question is like, so what? Can you actually achieve the second step with that? And I think what we've shown is yes, you actually can. But yeah, what we've seen is like, even in this sort of stepping stones along the way, there's like a lot of value in having all of this context that normally is lost to build this interactive model of a person.
It seems like you were having these ideas of like a human's lasting impact. I love this idea of a tangible asset, like a fingerprint on other people's brain, on your own brain. I haven't heard it kind of expressed like the physical way that you described it. I think we're like more familiar with this notion of people living on through like in the minds of others, but I've never thought about that like biologically before. So I think that's kind of a cool idea. We have spoken about this, but I had my own loss of losing my dad around the time like LLMs were coming out, and I was reading all these papers, and like I think there is something really human in learning about the technology, learning what it can do, and then quite quickly, if you have experienced like mortality in some way, connecting the dots and being like, hey, is there something we can do here? I thought something kind of interesting that you said is, as you were like experimenting with technology, like obviously very well positioned with a technical brain to be thinking about this at this time, but the products on the market are almost more like a hive mind than
Right.
they are an individual. I'm wondering if you could just like talk to that a bit more. It kind of reminds me of that series like Pluribus,
Yeah.
like this notion of like one like joint consciousness or something. But yeah, before we dig into sentience specifically, I'm curious to understand your take on how you were viewing the existing models pre-sentience.
I have maybe a bit more of a spiky take here, which is I actually do worry about a future in which we outsource a lot of our thinking to the same one-size-fits-all models. And especially when those models are sort of handed to you in a way that has been designed by like a select handful of people. So really what you get is like 3 models, but even those 3 are generally the same as well. And if you subject them to any form of like personality assessment or political assessment or generally like opinionated surveys, yes, there are like sort of guardrails. So it'll say, oh, I can't talk about politics, which in and of itself is actually can be annoying. Like that actually like already kind of is like flagging something that I'm like a little bit turned off by. They're very reflective of like the mentality of the people that created them, which is like a little bit of the Bay Area like skew. And again, for better or worse, like sure, there's some objective things like we can talk about like objective morality that like I guess I'm glad are kind of enforced. Like I don't want a model that's just like a neo-Nazi that's like going wild on the internet. Within that margin, like there's still like actually a diversity of opinions that are kind of lost and like compressed down. And that's like, okay, that in of itself is like kind of worrisome, right? But like if you compound that with the fact that like the usage of these models, like I don't know the exact number, but like the percentage of LinkedIn posts that are generated by AI grows every day. So like as a result, the percentage that's consumed grows every day. The amount of content that's produced by like this one single entity is like will eventually dominate like all of the content you produce if left kind of like at its current trajectory. Like if you look on Reddit of like knowledge bases or like discussion forums, the sentiment is already like terrible, right? So it's like I'm not saying anything sort of like uniquely crazy, but what I will say, and like where my sort of pushback against the Redditors is that actually I think what people are upset about is not the essence of just AI in general. It's quite easy now to like identify the patterns that AI uses. That's like very trivial. I would liken it to this sort of analogy of like, imagine if every time you open Twitter and LinkedIn and whatever, you just see like the same guy. It's just like one guy, and you just get that one guy's thoughts. You'd be like, dude, shut the fuck up. Like, I'm tired of hearing you. And this is like quite close to the world of, yes, it's posted by different accounts, and yes, they're prompting it with different things and potentially providing different context. So yes, like a post about, go-to-market strategy is going to be like different than like a post about cars or something. But it's still like the closest analogy is like, imagine if like this one guy, Bob, is just writing everything, and like Bob is kind of like a like middle of the road on everything. He has no strong opinions. You'd be like, man, I fucking hate Bob. Like Bob is the worst. And so I think it's like almost like the vitriol is kind of applied in the wrong. Like it's not AI. Like AI doesn't have to be like this. That would be my claim. That's just where we are now. And instead, like, yeah, if you could get like a wide range of divergent voices and styles and like some crazy things and then like some different ways of expressing ideas, you'd be like, wow, AI is like really cool. So I think it's just like that frustration of you're reading something produced by the same underlying model, the same underlying weights. And so yeah, connecting to what we're trying to do is like, yeah, what if like like the same way that each human being can participate in forums or even, internally in a company, like a discussion via Slack or, even eventually like we'll build sort of voice and avatars, like the same way that a meeting of like 5 people who each have like very different views, like that's like we have in this room, we'll have sort of meetings with our team, and those are like really, really invigorating conversations versus like 5 Claudes. It's just like, it's not as impressive or not as sort of interesting. And then if you can kind of like multiply that to like a civilizational scale, you realize like this is almost necessary. Like human beings in a world where everything collapses, like I actually don't know like what that looks like. That actually could be like a potentially catastrophic outcome. So yeah, I think those, again, like not to make too big a deal out of it, but I think it's less of a hypothetical is kind of my point. It's like this already is happening. Like people are already kind of atrophying their own like willingness to, create like radical and transformative ideas. So as much as we can fight against that, I think that would be part of our mission.
It's funny you say like fight against that, because the thing that occurred to me listening to you unpack it is that there's almost like 2 opposing forces. There's the world as it exists today and the kind of like rejection of cognitive flattening, it almost sounds like, which understandably is coming from like fear of what would happen if we continue down this trajectory. But then on the other hand, it seems like you have a really strong like offense as well. Like it's not all the defense against that future world. It's also like what are the positives of a world in which we could create models that like deeply mirrored someone's own individual thinking. So maybe it's a good like segue to you like talking a bit about how the product works, what it does enable, and kind of trying to introduce the technology you have created on that like positive trajectory.
I love the framing of the offense and defense, because I think there's like one option, which is just like ban AI like from all schools and so on. We've had a lot of conversations with professors, for example, and like wide range. Like some people are just like no AI at all, like even for studying. And it's like, really, like how do you even enforce that? And so that's like clearly not the right answer. We actually like don't think of AI as like there's some companies that are like AI detectors, and it's very much like, okay, you know, get rid of AI slop, and like that's like cool, I think, in a certain domain. But yeah, we actually think we can leverage AI and still solve the underlying inherent problem. So sentience at its core is about creating a agent of yourself, a unique model of you, your mind, your values that can actually take action for you, so it can actually operate. And then ultimately it can actually be like a proxy for you. So how does this work? The first step 0 is capturing all of the information. This comes from being able to connect to any sources that hold context from your life. This is kind of like, okay, we have to get information from your brain into our modeling system. Okay, Neuralink is like not mass market yet. There's like sort of some advancements in the BCI space. But our thesis is actually like a little bit simpler, like at least initially, which is like there is enough latent data about you that is sort of like the expression of your output already, namely like things you've written, things you've created, your spoken word, that we can actually like from that back out the underlying function, at least like within some level of accuracy, right? We're not gonna like mirror every single neuron in your brain. We're not gonna like try and scan your brain. Step 1 is like, okay, we have to like actually have enough sort of training data from you that we can back out the underlying model. Step 2 is like, okay, we can compound this through time, right? So like, okay, me 6 months ago, we actually need to like, we'll continuously ingest all of this content. And then like the real question is like, okay, great, I've like created this model of myself, like so what can it do? And for that, I think there's kind of like a progression. So the first thing is actually quite simple, and I would put this in the sort of like productivity category. At level 0 is productivity, and then at level N, there is basically what I would call immortality, like digital immortality, right? And that's hard to measure because like, you know, what do you truly view as immortal? But so level 0 is like making you more productive, augmenting your output. This is everything from being able to connect the dots across all of your different life threads. Our product is used by a lot of chiefs of staff, a lot of CEOs, a lot of founders who inherently have tons of different balls in the air. And so like one thing Sentience is really good at is like building this unified mind around all of those threads. So again, it's like not quite the cosmic like immortality, but like being able to understand, hey Sam, proactively, like you have this amount of work to do today. Here are like the 3 threads in your life. I actually like modeled the entire product surface here off of a Steve Jobs realization, which is like every day, really what you need to do is the 3 things, the most important 3 things. If you do the most important 3 things every day, you do that every day. This is like better than 99% of what people are doing. What we'll actually show you is basically like what are the most important 3 things. And in a lot of cases, Sentience can actually do those for you, right? So we can like draft an email, we can set up conversations, we can prep you for things. We can surface information that you may have forgotten about or not noticed. We can connect dots that you may have not realized. So this like all takes place on your sort of like home base interface. We're actually like just shipped this like a couple of days ago. So it's like kind of this like home base for your life, like the operating system for your digital mind. Step 1 is, can Sentience actually be a proxy for you and actually like reflect your decision making, your judgment, your values? Because again, everything I mentioned in step 0, like I think our product does it better than any other product on the market, but you actually don't like there is not like the imperative to have kind of your essence for that, right?
I mean,
So
if anything, Sam, like one thing I think just on step 1 is I'm like, man, like operationally, maybe I'm not the strongest. It's actually useful for that like original brain to perhaps not be like model in the essence of Nick for stage 1. It's just like something I can ingest all of my data into, and it makes my life easier keeping things on track. But I'm curious, like, to hear then the progression to, if that's like 0 table stakes, what does like 1 step into being a proxy for you look like?
I'll start with like a couple of concrete examples. One is my sentience actually can make decisions that reflect my own on like product spec review, on hiring conversations, on like discussions within my team, on if candidates ask me questions about like what is the role like, or what do you value, or how do you think about the future of the company. This is where you go beyond sort of like what you could ask Claude or what you could ask sort of like a status quo AI. Because even with like Claude with a ton of context, you're sort of missing the like, you create the dots, what you're kind of missing is like the lines between the dots. And so a net new situation that Sentience encounters, what we do is we actually model all of your principles. One part I skipped in my bio that actually is quite relevant is I spent some time at Bridgewater, which is a hedge fund started by Ray Dalio. And Ray Dalio is an amazing guy for a lot of reasons, but he is like kind of like this savant level thinker with regards to sort of like feedback and principles. And so they have this thing called dot collector, and then they call it baseball cards. But basically what it is every single interaction, like we had this conversation, at the end of it, we would like rate each other across a bunch of different dimensions. And then what you sort of get from that is like a representation of a person across like strengths and weaknesses. Now, the downside is like it requires like a very high level of sort of like, thick skin, willingness to rate each other. Also people are like spending hours a day. At some point it like becomes a productivity drain. But what you get from it, and this was pre-AI, so they never actually like turned this into kind of closer to what we're doing. But what you get from this is like a really accurate representation of a person. And what we do is basically the exact same thing, but it doesn't require the same like obsessive level of feedback from your peers. You basically can extract this from information that's already there. And the second thing is like the sort of fixation on principles or like values. You can go to my public profile and you can scroll through. I have about like 15 core principles, ranging from like AI should augment the best and brightest of humanity, like to my thoughts on privacy and things like that. And so when Sentience encounters like a net new scenario, it's actually able to like fall back or like rely on those principles for how it can like think about or answer that question. So this like all is inspired by like sort of modeling how like actually, at least cognitively, the human mind works, which is like generally based upon like values and principles that are like learned from experience. And these will update over time, right? So if I'm like, okay, I actually like changed my mind about something, like I can go back and see the progression.
Are the core principles the same for everyone? Not like the same like rating on each, but is it the same like framework that you apply to everyone?
Oh, good question. Yeah, like the sort of attributes that we measure people against. So we have two categories. So the first category is actually sort of like predefined traits that are sort of like more numeric, like basically a number between 0 and 1. The actual extraction of your values and principles is like fully open-ended. And so, yeah, one thing like we're quite good at is like without like a priori knowing the actual human's principles, being able to like come up with a set of principles that actually align, like compared to asking a human to write their own, like asking another person to assess what this person well, what their principles are. So essentially it's like, you have this agent, this entity that has seen all of your actions, all of your experiences, and kind of knows from that what you care about, what you don't care about, how you react to certain things. And then we'll surface this to you so you can kind of see like in and of itself just like the extraction of your mind into like a page that explains kind of who you are, at least what we can quantify.
And I mean, we're familiar with some abstractions like Myers-Briggs, like springs to mind as a popular way to think about yourself. And through that process, you're like answering questions and then you get this output, which even does like quantify your like introvert versus extrovert, things like that. The values and principles is interesting to me. Is it editable?
Yeah, this was a dilemma for us. This was like can you like write in the box and say my value is I am the smartest human alive and you know whatever. Or another interesting sort of like dilemma is, you know, if someone is like bigoted or racist, like do you aim to like accurately represent that and show that to them? And so like actually in some sense our system, because it's like objective and because it's kind of seeing you without the ego behind it, like or like without the pure sense of self, like it actually can show you things that like maybe you disagree with. So TLDR is we made all of this editable. The one thing you can't edit is, or the several things you can't edit are the traits between 0 and 1. So again, this was something we explored, like, you know, what would a model look like where you can just like drag the sort of like curiosity to like max, like just, oh, I want to be super curious. We've had a lot of users that are like, we had a professor that's like, oh, can you kind of like plug in Richard Feynman's corpus into like my digital brain and kind of like allow me to channel his level of, you know, lecturing and simplification ability. So we're like, no, we don't allow you to do that. But yeah, it's a really interesting sort of like philosophical problem. Is like, is this like the pure accurate representation of you? Well, already no, because again, it's like represented in silicon and it has perfect memory, like it has better memory than a human. So like already it's like in some sense superhuman. But like again, the risk is like, do you actually want to converge to everyone's kind of like optimal self? And like I would argue no. But yeah, these are like a bunch of things we're trying to strike the right balance on.
It makes me think of two things. One is, you know, sentience doesn't turn on without you giving permission. And of course, I want to leave like a decent amount of time here to talk about privacy, security. I think there's a lot to talk about on that front. But that aside for a moment, you are aware when sentience is on, and I wonder, like even for myself, how that changes behavior, knowing that something is observing you and like making kind of an assessment of you. I think that's just like an interesting psychological confounding factor, I guess. But assuming that you just like have to take that, and obviously you would never like turn on sentience for someone who wasn't aware of sentience being on, so I think you just kind of have to accept that one. The other thing immediately makes me think of is, you know, I often think, man, I wish I could go back and like throw my whole life into being a scuba diver instructor, or like being an author, being a surgeon, being a pilot, like so many different routes. But like realistically, most people only get to experience like certain careers and certain paths and things like that. And you talking about this notion of like capturing a version of you in the way that you think immediately makes me think like, wow, I wish I could version that thing and just create 100 like Nick experiments and see what like the Nick brain would be like if I'd taken it down other routes.
There's like this aspect of like counterfactual simulation that in some sense we enable. We built this concept of personas actually since we last spoke, which is another kind of like interesting decision for us. The idea being, rather than sort of this like one holistic representation of you, you actually may have kind of like skews of like subsets of yourself with certain goals and certain guardrails. This connects to like the privacy stuff, and this emerged from like necessity of like, okay, very obvious, I share a different set of information with my team than I share with prospective engineers who are interviewing with us. This is just like very kind of like necessary. I have to segment this somehow. And so the ultimate version of this is actually that your sentience can learn these things. And we do this already. So we maintain a mapping of every single relationship you have, and like generally like what the level of familiarity and like sort of what information is shared. But the problem is if I told you that and I said, oh, we've done a lot of work on this and it's really great, like there's still like, even I creator of this thing would find it difficult to trust sharing that like with, we call it the 4chan test because it's like, would you post this on 4chan? 4chan being notorious for like, hacking things, like DDoSing people, like, fucking with people. Would you post like a link to talk with this digital version of yourself on 4chan, knowing that like, okay, there's actually going to be some like attempts to jailbreak and extract information, and like a little bit less significant is like, okay, would you, for me, it's like, would I share this with the engineers versus like my team? And the problem is like, I actually need to have a fairly permissive version with my team, because otherwise it's like my team will ask something, and if my sentient says, sorry, basically if it hits guardrails, then it's a very frustrating experience. And then on the flip side, like, it needs to know when to not share information. So we shipped this concept of personas, which you can define with a certain goal and a certain set of guardrails, and then we'll like kind of help you. We run an agent that actually will take your goal and then like translate that into segmenting your data, and then you can manually do this as well. But it was an interesting thing for us because, again, like I said, optimally, like if you fast forward this and if you think about actually like a human, like I am making the discernment over whether or not, like on this conversation right now, I am like making, like there's a process running in my brain that is like discerning what information to share, what not to share. That process is basically always running in any social interaction. And so if you kind of like extend out this concept of personas, it's basically like it eventually becomes just like some sub-agent that is basically always making the judgment call. And this is how we've modeled it. So actually under the hood, it will be able to progress towards this sub-agent that can like make these decisions in any interaction. You have to start with like certain buckets, and then you can kind of make it more high fidelity or like sort of granular over time. So we shipped personas, but to your point, kind of going back to the simulation and like, what would Nick as a scuba diver, what would like 5 years, like, I don't know where the fork in the road is. What would the 5 years after the fork look like? This is basically achievable using that combination of personas. And one very obvious thing is if you cut data off at a certain point in time, right? You say, okay, everything after 2022, you just exclude from the set. You apply the same forward simulation, and then you can give it a scenario. Is it achievable? We haven't shipped any surface around that, but it is really fascinating. I can share, if you're curious, some examples of runs of this. Eventually, this may morph into an actual product surface where you can simulate thousands of outcomes and, okay, given some decision in a scenario, how would I carry myself forward in an upcoming board meeting? Like, what actual trajectory should I follow through that conversation? So
yeah, it seems like there's like two ways to model. You can think about like addition of data you don't have. So for me to like experiment with surgeon Nick, I'd have to just like insert a bunch of medical knowledge. I mean, that's hugely reductionist. You learn so much in practice, etc., etc. But if I was able to just insert the chip of like having gone to medical school and then speak to that version of Nick, it's kind of interesting thinking about like your style of thinking combined with more data. And then equally interesting is like the idea of subtracting data. And of course, since a lot of the data that Sentience has is based on your life, then you could say, yeah, like what would I look like without the context of 2024 as a year? And then it starts to feel a bit like eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. Like how do I erase some of my history? I feel like we could go down either of those rabbit holes or talk a bit more about the examples. But I realized that given that I know a bit about the product already, maybe it would be useful to bring it back to, for a person who has never experienced sentience, at the beginning you were kind of running us through like, hey, the first thing is it ingests data and helps you with productivity, get stuff done. Level 2 is with all of the context it's learned from your life, you can start to automate actions. But I'm curious if you could just, in the same way that you would tell another non-technical friend, just talk about what it's like to open up Sentience on your desktop. Is it like a chat window? Like, what's it actually like to use this product?
Yeah, of course. So we're a desktop application right now on Mac OS. Eventually we'll be on Windows and I guess Linux You have a mobile app as well, but fundamentally the first onboarding experience is you're summoning or birthing this digital self into the world. I'm actually quite inspired by RPG video games, which have very good character creators, and I think there's like some yearning that I would say a lot of people have, and we've actually found this. We shipped this very crude avatar generator during onboarding, and the first requests are like, can I change the outfits? Like, can I like do different styles? And we're like, totally adjacent, but like I totally get it, right? It's like you sort of have ownership of this new thing. It's like this self, right? So yeah, the first thing you'll experience is kind of going through that flow. And then a lot of it is like providing the right amount of information to actually get started with an understanding of you.
Yeah, I guess like even more like tactically. So I literally go on, like I download Sentience, I now have the app, I create my avatar. Like tactically, what's next? Like what data is required from me? Or do you need like no data to access the productivity level 0? What's required?
So you can technically use Sentience with like very little data, like as in connecting nothing. We require your LinkedIn at the moment. The idea here is we basically need to maintain a mapping between some source of record of you as a human and this thing. Yeah, so really Sentience works best when you at least give it some amount of latent information to work with. Email is kind of the best starting point. 2 reasons. One, it actually represents your generative output, so it contains, a lot of things that you've created, written, people you've interacted with, relationships you've maintained. And again, like you'd be surprised, like actually with a full inbox, like you can really accurately model a person. You can model like who they spend time talking to, who they used to talk to, who they don't talk to anymore, what business needs and priorities there are. So email is like a really good starting point. iMessage, Slack, and sort of like the other messaging is like another really good starting point. That's like what I would call category A, which is like generative output. A lot of folks will upload like blog content as well. So things they've written, even like some people upload PDFs and documents they've written. The second category is like what I would call like knowledge bases. So this is like things like Notion, Apple Notes, Google Drive, places where like latent knowledge about you, your organization, your work lives. And yeah, those two combined are kind of like up to the user of like what they want Sentience to be able to reason over. And you can always connect more as you sort of like fill out the product. The final category is actually like what I call is like the lost to the void capture, which is being able to capture things like this conversation, and actually capture like what you're working on via like your desktop. So like what actual applications you're using. Like if I merge or if I have a back and forth in a GitHub pull request on a certain feature with an engineer, right? Maybe I haven't connected, like we don't directly connect to GitHub, but what I can do is we can capture that by living on your desktop and extract that piece of information and store that as a memory. Again, like we offer like pretty robust sharing configuration, so like that may be something you only want to keep like for yourself. But yeah, all in all, that will sort of form like the knowledge base. And so then we have like an agent experience on top of that. So you'll open the app, you see the homepage, and in that sort of Steve Jobs framework, we will highlight like the 3 highest priority things for you. And in many cases, Sentience will actually be able to proactively already take action on like some subset of those highest priority items. So again, my highest priority item today is I want to write a response to Gwern, who just published a piece on sort of like the necessity for a personal AI that can like emulate human beings. So obviously very in line with what we're doing. What Sentience has done for me is not write the article. Again, like we're actually like a little bit opinionated here, so it actually hasn't just like dumped like a full article. What it's done is it has pulled all of the relevant like thoughts and nuggets and memories and experiences from all of this data that might be relevant for me to like inspire me to write this piece. And then I can of course like direct it to say, oh, actually like drill one layer deeper into that thought I had at 2 a.m., 3 months ago. Like tell me more about like kind of what I was thinking, and it can extract that. So yeah, homepage kind of looks like the control panel, the operating system, where I can dispatch things. The final surface I think that we haven't yet touched on is being able to like share this and then like create these shareable entities. So Sentience right now can join Slack, it can join iMessage, it has a standalone web interface where you can share it with people who want to chat with it. So we mirror your voice, so you can just talk to it. You can have as long a conversation as you want. It will pause and think and respond, and it's quite conversational. Like it's sort of like, early innings-ish of this, but we imagine that this will feel like really, really natural in like, a couple months. So then the last piece is like proactivity. So actually if you add it to Slack or iMessage, it can actually be proactive. So it can see what conversations are going on. For example, on our team, if my sentient sees like a discussion that's worthy of my 2 cents, it will just decide to respond and it will just say what it thinks. And again, we've modeled it not to necessarily like do the sort of like full loop of action, but rather to like provide the necessary context or like the sort of like opinions and memories and thoughts that I, as a human being, have, right? So concrete example, this morning, sort of like big debate over an engineering candidate who came in for a work trial. He did this well, he didn't do that too well. And my sentience kind of gave a big overview of like my values when it comes to hiring and like what I look for in certain candidates, and then kind of reflected like, okay, he kind of matches these things that I look for, but doesn't match these other things that I look for. So I didn't have to type that out. I didn't have to think about that. I didn't actually even have to like be online with my team. It just can respond and sort of share the knowledge that I have.
Got it. So it strikes me that there's like a tension, I guess, in that to make sentience maximally useful, it has as much information about you as possible. And you like referenced emails being a big thing and like being able to capture your bi-directional interaction with the world. So, I mean, now is maybe a good time to talk about hearing that. I want that thing. I feel nervous about giving away that information. So I'm wondering how you guys think about privacy, and maybe within that you can talk a bit about like how does it actually work? What does it mean to give this data? Who am I giving it to? Where is it going?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think we have like a pretty foundational obligation on making sure that we build this the right way. There's 2 pieces. So the first piece is what I would like bucket under like you feeling comfortable that you own this data, that like this data is not actually being like sold or shared or used to train models other than your own sentience, right? So a lot of people say you connect something, this is not used to train any AI model. Like for us, it's actually, it is used to train an AI model, but the AI model that it's used to train is actually like owned by you and fully controlled by you, right? So we're not like, this data doesn't actually like get passed to any of the model providers. This data actually doesn't get viewed, like isn't visible by anyone on our team. And there's like a few ways that we achieve that, or sort of like a few steps along the way that achieve that. The first is that each user within our infrastructure has an isolated enclave. So this actually is like somewhat expensive for us, and like spinning up within AWS for each user. Like generally like companies will do this like per company or something, which like, again, can scale, but we do this like literally for every single person, every single sentience that's created. And so like what that means is like your data is basically segmented from other people, and then also it's like segmented from like the overall engineering development environment. The second piece on ownership is, I think like, how do I feel confident that like I can do what I want with this entity that I'm creating? Because I think it's actually like, yes, we're here now in 2026 and there's like certain capabilities, but obviously I'm very confident that like both from our own contributions as well as just like the general like beta wave rise of AI progress, like this is going to be much more powerful very soon. And so the question is like, yeah, how do I feel confident? So this I think connects a little bit more towards like the legal side, but we've drafted our terms to allow 2 things. One is you actually own the entity you create. We don't. This is like fairly unique, and you can kind of see how we do this with regards to like the structure of our terms. The second thing is like, because it's an asset that you own and control, like you can take this data offline. Like if you want to just like take your sentience and host it on your own machine or whatever, figure out how to like serve this, both the underlying model as well as like the memory infrastructure, you can do that. You can also like do what you would with any asset, like your house or your car, which is you can leave it in your will to your next of kin. You can sell it if you want to. You can rent it out. This is up to you to like actually figure out what to do. We already have like a handful of people that have like sort of thought about this explicitly. Like they have actually thought about, okay, like my daughter is going to be the one that will like have stewardship over my sentience, like when I pass away. And yeah, it's going to be really cool for us, I think. I mean, you know, not cool like when somebody passes away, but like cool for us when we can see kind of the actual tangible realization of like the thing. We will actually achieve the thing that I'm sort of setting out, at least inspirationally, to do, which is like to be able to leave a digital version of yourself for your children or whoever. So yeah, that's on the ownership piece. And then there's a lot of that we do on this sort of like security side. I think it's like the TLDR is like we have enterprise grade security, both from like certification standpoint, as well as just like a technical standpoint. I think it's like extremely secure, and we've like, you know, sort of slowed down our development enough to like treat this really, really seriously, which again is like a trade-off. In our case, we've really hardened this to be fully secure. So yeah, I think like the TLDR is like you fully own this thing. It's private to you. We don't share this data with model providers. We don't allow others to train. And we have like enterprise grade security.
That made me think of two things. One is, I guess, just like clarifying. So it doesn't get sent to a third party. Is that right? Like there's no, like how does it actually work technically?
Oh yeah, so we do rely on other models, like not just purely open source models. And like two things there. One is like we have zero data retention agreements with all of them. So basically like the prompt is transient to the runtime, like the inference time. Essentially meaning like, okay, they can't store the prompt and output and then go back and train on it, right? Because like if you use the ChatGPT web app, whatever you submit is going to be like used by them to improve the model. Like I don't know that I like there is obviously a debate to be had on whether ChatGPT should be doing that, but like for us that's not how we operate. We don't allow providers to maintain and then subsequently train on sentience data. But yeah, we are using other models, like other cloud provider models.
So it's like technology currently built on top of frontier models, but in terms of the exposure to them, it's only the same as putting it into Claude or putting it into GPT.
No, so
It's actually better than that.
Yeah, it's better / just there's no retention.
Okay.
By the way, like the interesting thing I think is like, what is the path forward of our sort of progression? And then also the thing is like what is used where. What we use the like frontier, like so right now it's Claude. We have switched between like Gemini and Claude. What we use those for is actually like the agentic harness for like calling tools and like basically like sort of running the underlying intelligence. And what we found is, so the alternative to that is there's basically two alternatives to using like Claude to do this. You can take a open source model, you can host it on your own, like we can host it on our own machines, and then we can like potentially fine tune it or like sort of adjust the weights in some way to achieve our goals. The second is like you can train a model from scratch. So you can be like one of the handful of folks that like amass a bunch of compute and then like actually go and do this. What we found is for the underlying actual agent harness, you actually just want basically the best intelligence. And right now that is like Claude in our evals. And then two is like what I mentioned about the sort of Q LoRa stuff. That's actually kind of like the speech function of sentience. And those are on top of, that is on top of like open source models that we then host. So it's like kind of an interesting split. What's actually happening like when I press enter on a message or like when I have a conversation with sentience is it's going through like a bunch of different models, each doing like small things. Like for example, there's one model just dedicated to retrieving and then constructing the like set of information that will form the answer. That's like its own kind of like world. There's like another model that's like purely responsible for just like deciding like filtering basically like on sensitive topics or like doing that discernment function. There's like that sort of Q LoRa like speech function, which is just purely like, can we kind of translate the output into like something that is like representative of how the real human being constructs their output. And there's like an interesting analog to the brain, which is like when I'm having this conversation, I mean, right now we're chatting and I don't know, it feels generally like pretty flow state, but like, you know, what's really happening is like, I'm like constructing general kind of concepts and then there's like a second like module in my brain. It's like, okay, let me take these concepts and like form, like English, for example, like this is most apparent when you think about different languages, like trying to translate or like English speaker speaking Japanese is like kind of forming like general concepts and then trying to like do some map to like their learned knowledge of Japanese. And that's like a very pertinent example when you realize like, okay, when that like Japanese outputter is not like fully trained, I don't know, like when it's not like fluent, then there's like, you realize that's the part, but you still have the same idea in your head, but it's just like, you can't express it in words. So that's actually how our system works under the hood. It's like, we generate the like rough ideas and like memories and so on. And then we have that like last step, which is like output in the voice of the user.
So is it fair to think of it as like a circus of agents to some extent, and there's like some ringmastery going on to direct them?
Yeah, exactly. And what we find is the ringmaster, you basically want to like, that's where you want to invest all your chips into intelligence, and that also corresponds with cost. The specific sub-agents can have slightly more specialized and thus in some cases faster, in some cases cheaper. We're optimizing obviously for intelligence, but also this can't take like 2 minutes to output like an answer. Like especially if you're having a live voice conversation with this thing, like it can't just pause for 15 seconds, think, and then output. Like it needs to generally like real time give you an output. So we sort of invest the intelligence in the ringmaster, and then each sub-agent kind of has its own specialization.
One thing that it brings to mind is, I mean, for one, this is like entirely optional. So, I assume like each individual deciding to use sentience or not is like taking that decision and then within it deciding which data to share or not, and like understanding the relative security and privacy to satisfy what they're comfortable with. But I am curious about your thoughts on the bidirectional data piece, because, let's say I wanted to use this conversation to feed my Nick sentience. Do I hit you up and say like, hey Sam, this is useful reflection on me, but it's going to take with it a bit of you? Like, how do you think about that piece?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think like this question has, like the sort of Overton window on this question has changed a lot in the last like 2 or 3 years. I think in large part to like Granola and then other meeting recording tools. I think it used to be generally like quite invasive when there was like a meeting bot. I think it still is. It's just like from a UX, it's annoying. But I generally assume that like any conversation will be like recorded in some capacity. Just based on the usefulness, like it's purely like a utility thing. The second piece, which I think is more interesting personally, is like the, like how does, like let's take the standpoint of your sentience. There's like a very obvious failure mode, which is if your sentience tomorrow says, oh yeah, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. I was a terrible student. I learned to code in detention. Like, okay, that's just like, no, that's me. So we solve that. So there's several ways we solve that. One is like we generally know your voice. Two is like you can do like very obvious things, like we'll pick up your mic as like you and the opposing mic as the other person. But you're getting at, I think, like a more fundamental thing, which is like, okay, but at least then it preserved like the mapping of our relationship. And then if like somebody asks, you know, Nick, what do you like think about what Sam is working on? Well, there's a huge corpus of information about what I'm working on, and then also, you know, some of your thoughts, but a lot of what I've said. So, you know, would I want that person to have access to like this conversation? I mean, my answer is yes in this specific example, but yeah, I think there's like two things we do. So one is like, again, we keep your generative word as like the sort of like mapping to you, and then in the underlying knowledge-based structure of your sentience, I would have my own sort of like entity. Like, so we represent people and we represent like projects, but people is kind of the important one here. And then if that person is asking you questions, like my representation doesn't necessarily flow through into like your output. But it's the TLDR is, it's a very fuzzy problem that we like haven't like, there's sort of like no like hard-coded solution here. But what we do is we basically have like a large constitution that we call like the discernment constitution, which like reflects a bunch of different ways that as I mentioned, there's a bunch of subagents. So one of the circus participants is basically this like discernment agent that has like a bunch of guidelines on how to like share information, and it's very conservative by default. And it's one of the sort of like criteria that it's judging on is like the shareability of like non-Nick like speakers. Like, and speaker can literally be a speaker, like I'm speaking, or it can just be like you're replying to a tweet. The parent tweet is not your content. The reply is your content. However, the reply in a vacuum makes no sense, right? So in the case of a tweet, it's public already. I think like the lesson that I've taken away is language models are actually pretty good at this. And really it's kind of like, if we can give you enough control over like who you're sharing this with, you can avoid some of the like catastrophic outcomes, or all of the catastrophic outcomes, but it's also fuzzy. So I don't know, this is something we're working on too, is like, how do you refine that discernment function, and how do you like make both sides feel good about it? Yeah, it's work in progress.
Yeah, it brings three things to mind for me. One is, I think there's probably like a philosophical level question of like, who am I without interaction with other people? So I think that, like, I think everyone to some extent like is who they are, or like that who you are is to some extent like proven in your interactions.
Yeah, exactly.
There's some like tree falling in the woods thing there. So I think there's a philosophical thing. I think there's a maybe like legal, like PCL kind of thing around like consent of, I am happy to like talk to you in this capacity, but I might not be open to sentience. So there's like a weird thing maybe of like opting out. And I think you're right in that to some extent that already exists today as a precedent of joining a meeting. Hey, it's going to be recorded. Are you okay with that? But I think that takes on a new level, because maybe I feel comfortable having you having a transcript of what I've said. Maybe I don't feel comfortable like sentience having a transcript. So I think it's like a consent piece. But I think that's also solvable with transparency. I could say no, for example.
Yeah.
Then I think there's like a third piece. I don't even know how to categorize this one, which feels like more emergent, which is sentience like brings forward the possibility of your essence to like exist as an object in like the technological sense. Let's say we put it online. Let's say I put online like 100 other similar conversations, and then let's say like someone wants to work with me, I don't want to work with them for whatever reason. Like it's weird to think that there's a world in which they could be like, don't worry, we'll take your nick data, which I've shared publicly and like freely, and create like a nick entity. It's like an emergent new type of consideration, I guess, and that is like a fearful example. I'm sure there's lots of like going right back to the very beginning of the conversations, very joyful and positive examples, like for example when I die giving my sentience to someone else, but it definitely, there's something like emergent there that feels different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the law is behind, as it often is, but there's an obvious example is if I have enough, like the obvious example is for a sort of public persona. Like if I have enough, like let's say YouTube videos or podcasts out there about me, it's actually quite trivial to just like scrape that. You wouldn't build a very great, like deep simulation in the way that we can, like, and it wouldn't be very like useful to that person, like just to take their YouTube videos or podcasts. But for example, you could take their voice and you could take like generally like enough of their content to get like, I don't know, like 20% of the way to like what like a real fleshed out sentience would be. There's a really interesting question of like, okay, let's agree that this is like a potential problem. How do you solve this? And so like one way that sort of like I mentioned WorldCoin, one way that some folks have attempted to solve this is like you literally have like a biometric link. And WorldCoin gives you like is a blockchain. They give you a token that's like mapped to your scanning your iris, and there's like a whole host of issues that they're running into as well with privacy and so on. But yeah, like, okay, that's like one end of the spectrum, like very sort of like rigorous. Another end of the spectrum is kind of like enforce this legally. Like for example, our terms are such that like if you attempt to create a sentience like unauthorized, this is just like against our terms. So that's enforceable by like a legal structure. Then like there's maybe like potentially some other technological solution behind this. Apps now do like ID verification and stuff, but it's like it doesn't fully address the like, okay, like I'm like content like you me like anyone I interact with, there's like a sufficient amount of content. So yeah, I don't know, it's a combination for us. I mean, again, like our terms are like I think strong enough that like we can potentially build like pretty robust systems around this, like a combination of ID verification and just like some like alerts or like alarms around this. But it is already very much possible and happening, like irrespective to the technology we're building. I know a lot of scams nowadays will use voice clones of children, and they'll call elderly folks and they'll be like, hey, I'm, need like $1,000 and so on and so forth. If 11 Labs is a company that makes is probably the most well-known voice cloning company, what's actually the solution there? They have a checkbox that says, I am the person that I'm cloning my voice of, and I consent, and so on and so forth. But I think now one thing they've introduced is you have to like read out a consent statement in your own voice, right? So that like I think gets around to like take my YouTube videos and do that. But anyway, I don't know. There's a lot here to figure out.
Yeah, my personal belief is that it doesn't get figured out without like hard conversations and deep thought. I think it has to start with conversation. I think people maybe are like a bit gun shy on like voicing opinions on some of this stuff, but I think it's like necessary to make progress. If you will permit me with one final question, one of the things that struck me in getting to know you and more about sentience is that I think you have quite strong beliefs and principles and thoughts on the world that you want to create. And you've said multiple times, even in this conversation, how sentience, like the driver is, this is your life's purpose. I've been thinking a lot about what's driving AI at the moment, whether that's research or a university and the end goal is research, whether it's a company and it's like revenue driven. But I think you've opened my mind to life's purpose as like a third axis of this. So I'm just curious, like, how does that change priorities, timeline, product? To what extent does your incentive behind the business change how you operate day to day?
Yeah, it's I don't know counterfactually because I don't know what building this business like not thinking it's my life purpose would be like. But I can say for sure, because I can contrast this to like my last business, I think it allows us to do two things. One, it allows us to be like a little bit more long-term and ambitious. And I'll pick on the Bay Area. I don't think it's limited to the Bay Area, but like generally with like the Bay Area startup culture is that because like doing a startup is now kind of like a in vogue and like socially respectable and sort of like higher status thing. But as far as I know, like doing a startup used to be like you're kind of like weird, like you kind of like people are like, ooh, sorry, like oh, you kind of like live in your parents' basement, like you know, hacking away. That's no longer the case, right? Like in fact, probably in the Bay, doing a startup, other than maybe the labs, is like probably the second best thing. It's like a funded like you know like startup with some money in the bank is like pretty good. But I think as a result, there's maybe like a de-emphasis on the sort of like long-termism or the like doing it for the sake of doing it thing. Like, I don't know, I look at like, there's like a certain class of like enlightened people, like Alyssa Liu is probably like one of them, but like there's like a certain class of enlightened people that I think just like create really, really amazing work, which is like people that are not necessarily like obsessively motivated by status and metrics. And if you read the Pope's encyclical, he like draws like this contrast around AI between like sort of like the analogy is the Tower of Babel in the Bible, but this sort of like pursuit of I guess what you would call fame or status and like money's interesting because like I actually would argue like money doesn't necessarily like fall into the same category, but like pursuing it, building a company for sort of the status and launch videos and numbers and hype and Twitter followers and so on, versus like building it for like the betterment of humanity, which again, my skew is that I'm generally a capitalist, and so I would argue that the betterment of humanity generally coincides with like a dollars, and so I actually would hesitate to put like pursuit of wealth in one of those two categories. So I don't know, I think like pursuing wealth is actually like generally an admirable thing. But I do think like it sort of frustrates me in a lot of like the companies purely built for like, I want to do a company or like I want to be a startup founder. I think the counter argument to me is there are probably many good companies built that way. Like it's actually not clear that like that is like that it's not clear that there is a correlation between the attitude that I have and the material success of a monetary outcome of a business. You might come up with the outcome that like, yeah, actually people that are purely motivated by numbers and fundraising announcements actually go on to do okay. But I look at companies like Linear, which I admire, you know, companies like Figma, and it's quite clear that like the founders of those companies are like not really motivated by playing the game, or like in the Paul Graham terminology, like hacking the test, like trying to play the game or hack the test. Carrie at Linear like often talks about how they, you know, take it slow. They don't really do like a ton of A/B testing or optimizing for metrics. They kind of just build a product they like. It's a little bit more of an artistic approach. Now he's a designer, right? So some of it emerges from that. Figma took a long time. Figma took 4 years before they really like went to market, and they built something amazing. Like they built like technologically, you know, this pre-AI, like technologically with WebAssembly as like a 2D collaborative canvas, like this was one of the most impressive sort of artifacts. Mm-hmm. I think if you're obediently following investors or general Silicon Valley zeitgeist, you're not going to spend 4 years riffing and iterating on the love of the game. I think it's a balance, to be honest, and I think the danger is you just get lost in the sauce and you like go off. And so like investors play a role. Like I think our investors are actually awesome at that. Like I think like maybe it's me, I'm just like very stubborn, but yeah, I do worry what happens to like general like, maybe this is overly, you know, heavy-handed, but like what happens to American capitalism when there's like a bit of a push towards, or like a sort of obsession with like metrics that don't really do anything, like fundraising numbers and like, you know, views on your launch video. OpenAI kind of a lot of these like real innovations kind of came from the like freedom to take your time. And yeah, I think if there's like one, I think like I've learned this for myself, which is like knowing that I am kind of in this for the long haul, and I will basically do this regardless of like numbers or prestige. This allows me to kind of like build a higher quality thing, because like all of my attention is towards building the quality of the thing, like rather than try to appease some short-term goal. I don't know. It's like a function, like there, like you have your local maxima, a function that goes like this with squiggles up and to the right. You can like pursue a local maxima, right? Like something that goes like this and then goes down. You'll like stop here. Versus I just want to pursue like the biggest thing.